This lesson will look at how to set the common configuration options that affect all users. Here you can see I've logged on as the system administrator and I'm navigating across into the administration screens and looking at the setup of users. Now, in an earlier lesson I set up a new user within the system called Alex Shipman, who works inside the team at customer service. Now, inside here there are a whole set of different settings which apply to this particular user, and we can see that a system administrator can decide whether or not the user has got things like access to the CRM list and access to the teams. But there are some things that are set not just at the level of the individual user, but across all users who match a particular type. For example, here you can see that this particular user is subject to the idea that passwords should expire. Now, that expiry of the password is carried out, or controlled rather, by settings at the level of the user configuration screen. We can come in here and see that we've got a number of days before the password expires. And if I navigate back to the earlier screen where we were working, we can see actually the 50 days has been used to provide the calculation for the password expiry date. The default, as we saw here on the administration user configuration screen, is set to 50 days. And we've got other things which control whether or not a user is going to follow particular password policies. We'll cover that in a different lesson. Notice as well on this particular screen we can control whether or not the individual user can access their preferences. If I switch across into the screen as that particular user and log on, we can see the preferences screen is shown on the My CRM menu, the first menu that you come onto, and this allows the user to be able to control their own particular settings. But in some implementations, system administrators need to be able to control that for the users themselves, not to allow the individual users to be able to set those preferences. And we can see that if we navigate to a user, and we can see this in this particular case, each user can be controlled by the system administrator through the user preferences tab associated with their user record. So if we go back into the user configuration setting, we can see the purpose of that allow user preferences. We can see as well, associated with the attempts to be able to access the system, we have an account lockout threshold setting. And this represents the number of times a user is allowed to try their password before they're locked out for the system. And so if you can see in my particular case, if they try it 3 times and they are not successful, then a message would be applied that they are locked out of the system, and they're locked out for 5 minutes until they are able to come back into the system. Now, the third setting that we see on this particular row, the user inactivity timeout, is one which will allow the logon page if to be redisplayed if a user has not been active inside their CRM account. So if they've not been looking at information, changing their screens, interacting with the screen for a particular period, then this would be the mechanism by which would cause them to be automatically logged out. And that, if it's set to be 0, is that there's no timeout, but if it's set to be 10 minutes timeout, then that obviously after 10 minutes the user is thrown out of the system. On this screen as well, we can see that we've got the IIS auto login and default domain for IIS auto login. I'd refer you to a specialized lesson that will cover that particular setting. I'm not going to cover that in details here. The next few settings all the way through to the auto sync in minutes are really to do with classic Outlook and Outlook plugin distribution. We can see that these plugin versions and the Outlook plugin versions are to do with checks to see which version of plugins are on the client machine, and if it differs from the server version, they would be reforced to download. With the Outlook plugin and the AutoSync plugin, this is to do with the use of the classic plugin where the Exchange integration is not being used. So if you have turned on Exchange server integration, this field would only apply, these fields would only apply in that case. I'm not going to cover that in any further details. I'd ask you to refer to the documentation for that. Auto logout is an important setting because this means that the session for the user is automatically destroyed when the user should close the browser or move away. So if I was to close the browser, then the session would automatically be logged out from within inside the server. And we've got other settings which control the way in which dates are used within inside the system as well. So here, with the idea of the date format, this is the date format that all users will apply, and that's the default setting, but it can be changed then by an individual user in their own preferences, if of course user preferences are allowed. Use fileIt, which we can see over here, is applicable where you are using the advanced mail manager, and you would need to be able to refer to the documentation about the advanced mail manager to learn more about the use of the idea of automatic filing of emails via the mail manager rather than the internal mechanism. And enable security for groups. This is an important idea because this is to do with the way in which a user has access to data. For example, if I switch back into CRM and here I log on as somebody like Brian Little, Brian Little, as we can see from his data, is in the territory US West and nevertheless has access to groups. And we can see that there's a group in here for US East Coast contacts. So if I look at this, we can see that although it tells him that there are 219 records in the group, none of them are available to him because they're all in the wrong territory. So he can't carry out any marketing tasks against this data. If preferences are changed at the user configuration level by the system administrator, and I turn off security for groups, then it means that a user like Brian Little can access data outside of their home territory in groups. Now this doesn't mean that they can read the information. If I quickly go back into this and look at this again, we can see that they can see the information, but it's only accessible for marketing purposes. If we try and go into this, we can see that individually the records, you can't go into that data. Okay, so you can't pop up that information to go into it. You can only see it at the level of the marketing campaign. So this then outlines the idea of the different rights that we might have setting across the system for all of the users within inside the user configuration screens. Areas such as the Outlook, classic Outlook, are covered elsewhere within inside the user and training resources. Thank you.